Marcus Henderson had always been the kind of person who lived for the laugh. At 23, he worked as a tour guide in London, showing groups of wide-eyed tourists around the historic landmarks that defined the city. His job required him to be entertaining, to keep people engaged with stories and jokes about British history and culture. What started as professional requirement had become his entire personality. Every morning Marcus would wake up in his small flat in Camden, already thinking about new ways to make people smile. He had a natural gift for comedy, the kind that made strangers feel like old friends within minutes. His colleagues at the tour company loved working with him because he could turn even the most boring historical facts into hilarious anecdotes. Tourists would leave his tours with sore cheeks from laughing, and memories they would treasure forever. But Marcus had a problem. The same drive that made him excellent at his job also pushed him toward increasingly risky behavior. What started as harmless jokes during tours had evolved into elaborate pranks in his personal life. He would spend hours planning practical jokes on his friends, his neighbors, and sometimes complete strangers. The bigger the reaction, the more satisfied he felt. His friends had started to worry about him. Sarah, his closest friend since university, had warned him multiple times about going too far. During their weekly coffee meetings, she would shake her head as Marcus described his latest schemes. She could see that his need for attention and laughter was becoming an addiction, but Marcus would always brush off her concerns with another joke. The problem was that normal pranks had stopped giving Marcus the rush he craved. Jumping out to scare someone or putting plastic wrap over a toilet seat felt childish now. He needed something bigger, something that would create a story people would tell for years. He began researching elaborate pranks online, watching videos of people doing increasingly dangerous and illegal things for entertainment. 3 weeks before the incident that would change his life forever, Marcus had been walking through central London after finishing a tour. The group had been particularly enthusiastic, laughing at all his jokes and asking for extra stories. The high from their positive reaction had carried him through the afternoon, but as evening approached, that familiar emptiness crept back in. Found himself walking past Buckingham Palace, watching the crowds of tourists taking photos with the famous red-uniformed guards. These guards, known for their stoic expressions and complete inability to react to provocation, had become something of a challenge for visitors. People would make faces, tell jokes, and try every trick in the book to get a reaction from these professional soldiers. Marcus stopped and watched for nearly an hour. He saw children making silly faces, adults telling elaborate stories, and teenagers doing ridiculous dances, all trying to crack the guards' legendary composure. Not once did any of the guards even blink in acknowledgement. Their discipline was absolute, their training complete. That night, Marcus went home with an idea forming in his mind. He had seen hundreds of people try to get reactions from the royal guards using conventional methods. But what if someone did something completely unexpected? What if someone did something so outrageous that it would become legendary? He spent the next several days researching everything he could about the royal guards. He learned about their training, their duties, their protocols. He discovered that they were real soldiers with real responsibilities, not just tourist attractions. But this information only made the challenge more appealing to him. Getting a reaction from someone so professionally trained would be the ultimate victory. Marcus began planning his prank with the same attention to detail he brought to his tour routes. He studied the guards' schedules, learning when they changed shifts and which posts were most visible to crowds. He researched the legal consequences of interfering with royal duties, but convinced himself that a harmless prank would result in nothing more than a warning. The idea that eventually took shape in his mind was simple, but dramatic. He would approach one of the guards with a cup of tea, pretending to offer it as a friendly gesture. Then, at the last moment, he would accidentally trip and splash the tea on the guard's uniform. The crowd would gasp. He would apologize profusely while trying not to laugh, and everyone would have a story to tell. What Marcus failed to consider was the temperature of the tea he planned to use. In his excitement about the visual impact of the prank, he overlooked the most dangerous element of his plan. He imagined the guard remaining stoic even while covered in liquid, creating an absurd image that would be both shocking and hilarious. His friends noticed that Marcus had become secretive about his plans. When Sarah asked what he was working on during their coffee meetings, he would just smile mysteriously and change the subject. He was afraid that if he told anyone about his idea, they would try to talk him out of it. Deep down, he knew that meant the plan was probably a bad idea, but he had become too invested in the fantasy to stop. The night before he planned to execute his prank, Marcus barely slept. He felt like a child on Christmas morning, excited and nervous about what the next day would bring. He had convinced himself that this would be his masterpiece, the prank that would make him famous among his friends, and maybe even get him some viral internet fame. He had no idea that within 24 hours, his name would indeed be known by thousands of people, but not in the way he had imagined. The consequences of his actions would ripple through his life like stones thrown into a calm pond, disrupting everything he had built and forcing him to confront the reality of who he had become. As Marcus finally drifted off to sleep that night, he was still smiling about his plan. Tomorrow would be the day he pulled off the ultimate prank. Tomorrow would be the day that changed everything. Marcus woke up that Tuesday morning with butterflies dancing in his stomach. The autumn sun streamed through his bedroom window, casting long shadows across the floor as he lay in bed, running through his plan one final time. He had called in, sick to work, telling his supervisor that he had food poisoning. The lie came easily, as most lies did to Marcus these days. After a quick shower, he dressed carefully in his most innocent-looking outfit, a navy blue sweater, khaki pants, and comfortable walking shoes. He wanted to look like any other tourist visiting the palace, someone who might reasonably be carrying a cup of tea and walking close to the guards. He practiced his accidental stumble in front of his bedroom mirror, timing the motion perfectly, so the liquid would splash dramatically. The morning routine felt surreal, like he was preparing for a performance rather than executing a prank. Marcus made himself breakfast but could barely eat, his excitement overwhelming his appetite. He kept checking the weather forecast on his phone, relieved to see that it would be a clear day with good visibility. Perfect conditions for maximum audience impact. Around 10:30, Marcus left his flat and made his way toward central London. He stopped at a small cafe near Victoria Station, ordering the largest cup of tea they served. The barista, a friendly woman in her 50s, smiled as she handed him the steaming cup. She had no idea that she was providing the weapon for what would soon become a criminal act. Marcus held the cup carefully as he walked, feeling the heat radiating through the cardboard container. The tea was extremely hot, almost burning his fingers even through the protective sleeve. For a brief moment he wondered if he should wait for it to cool down, but the rational thought was quickly overwhelmed by his excitement. The walk to Buckingham Palace took about 20 minutes, during which Marcus rehearsed his performance mentally. He imagined the shocked gasps from the crowd, the guards' stoic reaction to being drenched, and the stories that would spread across social media within hours. He pictured himself as a legend, the man who finally broke through the guards' legendary composure. When Marcus arrived at the palace, he was pleased to see a substantial crowd gathered around the guards. School groups, families with young children, and clusters of international tourists were all jockeying for the best photo positions. The morning shift change had occurred about an hour earlier, meaning the guards would be fresh and alert. He positioned himself near the central guard post, where a tall soldier in the iconic red uniform stood perfectly still. The man looked to be in his late 20s with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of years of military training. His bearskin hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but Marcus could see the intense focus in his expression. For nearly an hour, Marcus watched and waited, looking for the perfect moment. He needed enough of a crowd to witness the prank, but not so many people that he would have trouble getting close to the guard. He also needed to time it perfectly with the tourist photography, maximizing the chances that someone would capture the moment on camera. As noon approached, Marcus noticed that the crowd was reaching its peak size. A large tour group from Japan had just arrived, along with several families and what appeared to be a group of university students on a study abroad program. The energy was perfect, with people chatting excitedly and cameras clicking constantly. Marcus took a deep breath and began his approach. He walked casually toward the guard, holding his teacup in both hands like someone carefully carrying a precious drink. To anyone watching, he looked like a tourist who had stopped for refreshment during his sightseeing tour. The guard, whose name was James Morrison, had been on duty for 3 hours. He had served in the British Army for 6 years and had been assigned to ceremonial duties at the palace for the past 18 months. During that time, he had encountered every possible attempt to break his concentration. People had shouted, danced, made faces, and even thrown small objects. Nothing had ever caused him to break protocol. James had noticed the young man with the teacup approaching, but thought nothing of it. Tourists often walked close to the guard posts while taking photos or reading the informational plaques. He maintained his focus straight ahead, breathing steadily and keeping his mind clear of distractions. What happened next occurred in less than 3 seconds, but those seconds would replay in Marcus's mind for the rest of his life. As he reached the optimal position, about 4 feet from the guard, Marcus executed his practice stumble. He lurched forward dramatically, extending the teacup toward the soldier. But something went wrong with the timing. Instead of simply splashing the guard's uniform as planned, the scalding liquid hit James Morrison directly in the face and neck. The temperature of the tea, which Marcus had barely considered during his planning, was nearly 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The reaction was instantaneous and terrible. James let out an involuntary cry of pain as the boiling liquid seared his exposed skin. His legendary composure shattered as he staggered backward, his hands instinctively moving toward his face. The crowd, which had been expecting to witness a harmless tourist mishap, instead saw a soldier suffering from what appeared to be serious burns. Marcus stood frozen, still holding the empty cup, as the reality of what had just happened crashed over him like a wave. This was not the harmless prank he had imagined. The guard was clearly in pain, and the liquid had been far hotter than he had realized. The crowd around him was no longer amused but horrified, with several people immediately calling for medical assistance. Within seconds, other guards had broken formation and rushed to their colleagues' aid. Palace security officers appeared as if from nowhere, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Someone in the crowd was already calling emergency services, describing what appeared to be an assault on a royal guard. James Morrison was quickly escorted inside the palace gates for medical treatment, his face and neck already showing signs of serious burns. Marcus watched helplessly as the man he had intended to prank disappeared behind the palace walls, probably on his way to a hospital emergency room. The crowd that had gathered for entertainment was now buzzing with shock and concern. Marcus could hear fragments of conversation around him. "Did you see that? Is the guard okay? That looked intentional. Someone should call the police." The atmosphere had completely changed from lighthearted tourism to serious alarm. Marcus realized that he was still standing in the same spot, holding the empty cup like evidence of his crime. His legs felt weak and his mouth had gone completely dry. This was not how the day was supposed to unfold. He had imagined laughter and social media fame, not ambulances and criminal investigations. Security officers were already moving through the crowd, asking witnesses what they had seen. Marcus knew that within minutes they would identify him as the person responsible. Multiple people had photographed or filmed the incident, meaning there would be clear evidence of his actions. His face would be visible in dozens of tourist photos and videos. The full magnitude of what he had done was beginning to sink in. He had seriously injured a person in the execution of a prank he had thought was harmless. The hot tea that had seemed like a minor detail in his planning had become the weapon in what could now be classified as assault. His life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. The next few minutes passed in a blur of chaos and confusion that would remain burned into Marcus's memory forever. As palace security officers moved efficiently through the crowd, questioning witnesses and securing the scene, Marcus felt his body betraying him. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air. A woman standing nearby had captured the entire incident on her smartphone. She was already showing the video to a security officer, pointing directly at Marcus as she explained what she had witnessed. The evidence was clear and undeniable. there would be no way to claim this had been a genuine accident. Marcus's first instinct was to run. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to drop the empty cup and disappear into the London crowds before anyone could stop him. He took 2 steps backward, ready to blend into the mass of tourists and escape the scene of what he now realized was a serious crime. But his escape route was already blocked. 2 palace security officers had positioned themselves strategically in the crowd, and one of them was looking directly at him. The officer, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression, began walking toward Marcus with purposeful steps. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need to speak with you about what just happened here." Marcus felt his throat close up. When he tried to speak, only a weak croak emerged. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I don't know what you mean," he said, immediately realizing how guilty he sounded. The officer's expression didn't change. "Several witnesses have identified you as the individual who threw hot liquid at our guard. I'm going to need you to stay right where you are while we sort this out." Around them, the crowd had begun to thin as tourists realized they were witnessing the aftermath of a criminal incident rather than a tourist attraction. Some people lingered, continuing to take photos and videos, while others hurried away, not wanting to become involved in what was clearly becoming a police matter. Marcus looked around desperately, searching for any possible escape route or explanation that might salvage the situation. His mind raced through potential excuses. It had been an accident, he had tripped, the cup had slipped from his hands. But he knew that the video evidence would contradict any story he tried to tell. "Look," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, as panic gave way to a desperate need to explain himself. "This whole thing was supposed to be just a harmless joke. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I didn't realize the tea was that hot." The security officer's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something closer to disgust. "A harmless joke?" he repeated. "Sir, you have just seriously injured a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard. That man is on his way to the hospital with burns to his face and neck." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Hospital. Burns. The guard wasn't just inconvenienced or embarrassed. He was actually injured and in need of medical treatment. The prank that had seemed so clever in Marcus's imagination had caused real harm to a real person. Within 10 minutes, the Metropolitan Police had arrived at the scene. Marcus watched 2 uniformed officers approach, their expressions grim as the security team briefed them on what had occurred. He could see them examining the smartphone footage that multiple witnesses had captured, their heads nodding as they viewed the clear evidence of his actions. The arrest itself was almost surreal. Marcus had seen countless arrests in movies and television shows, but experiencing it firsthand was completely different. The officer's words seemed to echo from far away. "Marcus Henderson, you are under arrest on suspicion of assault. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court." The handcuffs felt cold and heavier than he had expected. As they were fastened around his wrists, Marcus felt the last vestiges of his old life slipping away. The man who had woken up that morning planning a harmless prank was gone, replaced by someone who would now be processed through the criminal justice system. The crowd of tourists watched, in fascination as Marcus was led away from the palace. He could hear cameras clicking and knew that photos of his arrest would soon be spreading across social media platforms. The viral fame he had craved was actually happening, but not in the way he had ever imagined. During the ride to the police station, Marcus sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out the window at the familiar London streets passing by. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but somehow completely different. The city that had been his playground for pranks and jokes now felt foreign and threatening. At the station, the booking process was methodical and humiliating. Marcus's personal belongings were cataloged and stored, his fingerprints were taken, and he was photographed from multiple angles. Each step in the process drove home the reality that he was no longer a free citizen, but a criminal suspect. The holding cell was small and stark, with concrete walls and a metal bench that offered no comfort. Marcus sat alone, replaying the events of the day over and over in his mind. He kept returning to the moment when the guard had cried out in pain, the sound echoing in his memory like an accusation. Hours passed before anyone came to speak with him. When the door finally opened, Marcus was greeted by a detective inspector who looked tired and annoyed. The woman appeared to be in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of expression that suggested she had seen too many cases like this. "Mr. Henderson," she said, settling into the chair across from him in the interview room. "I'm Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh. We need to discuss what happened at Buckingham Palace today." Marcus's legal troubles were just beginning. The detective explained that he was being charged with assault causing actual bodily harm, a serious offense that could result in significant prison time. The fact that the victim was a member of the Royal Guard working in an official capacity would likely result in additional charges and enhanced penalties. As the interview progressed, Marcus began to understand the full scope of what he had done. The guard, James Morrison, had suffered second-degree burns to his face and neck. He would require extensive medical treatment and would likely be off duty for several weeks while he recovered. The incident had also disrupted palace security protocols and caused significant public concern. Detective Inspector Walsh made it clear that this was not going to be treated as a simple prank gone wrong. The Crown Prosecution Service would likely pursue the case aggressively, both because of the serious nature of the injuries and because of the high-profile location where the assault had occurred. When Marcus was finally allowed to make a phone call, he chose to contact Sarah, his closest friend. Her reaction was everything he had feared it would be. The disappointment in her voice was worse than anger would have been. "Marcus, what have you done?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I warned you this would happen. I told you that you were going too far." That night, as Marcus lay on the narrow cot in his cell, he finally began to grasp the magnitude of the consequences that were about to unfold. His job would certainly be lost when his employer learned about his arrest. His reputation in the close-knit tour guide community would be destroyed. And most importantly, he had seriously injured an innocent person who had simply been doing his job. The prank that was supposed to make him famous had indeed accomplished that goal. But the fame was the kind that would follow him for the rest of his life in the worst possible way. 3 days after his arrest, Marcus was released on bail pending trial, but freedom felt nothing like he remembered. The conditions of his release were strict. He could not approach within half a mile of any royal residence, could not leave London without permission from the court, and had to report to the police station twice weekly. These restrictions transformed his familiar city into a maze of forbidden zones and constant anxiety. The news of his arrest had spread far beyond what he could have imagined. Within hours of the incident, videos of the assault had gone viral across multiple social media platforms. The footage, taken from several different angles by tourists, showed clearly that Marcus's actions were deliberate and premeditated. There was no ambiguity about what had happened, no room for alternative interpretations. British tabloids had seized on the story with their characteristic enthusiasm for scandal. Headlines screamed about tea terror at the palace and tourists, scalding attack on Hero Guard. Marcus's social media profiles had been discovered and dissected by internet detectives, with every photo and post scrutinized for signs of his character flaws. His entire life was being judged by strangers who knew nothing about him beyond this single terrible moment. The worst part was discovering what had happened to James Morrison, the guard he had injured. Medical reports revealed that James had suffered second-degree burns covering 12% of his face and neck. The scalding tea had caused immediate blistering and would likely leave permanent scarring. He had undergone emergency treatment at St. Thomas's Hospital and would require multiple surgeries over the coming months. Marcus learned these details through his solicitor, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Collins, who specialized in criminal defense. She had been recommended by Sarah's father, who worked in the legal profession, and she had made it clear from their first meeting that his case would be extremely challenging to defend. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," Patricia had explained during their initial consultation. "We have multiple video recordings, dozens of eyewitnesses, and clear physical evidence. The prosecution isn't going to offer any kind of plea deal because they don't need to. They have you dead to rights." Patricia had outlined the charges Marcus was facing with clinical precision. The primary charge was assault causing actual bodily harm, which carried a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. However, because the victim was a serving member of the military performing official duties, additional charges were being considered, including assault on a person serving the crown and causing grievous bodily harm with intent. The financial implications were staggering. Even with legal aid, Marcus was facing thousands of pounds in legal fees. His employment had been terminated immediately when his employer learned of his arrest, leaving him without income while dealing with mounting expenses. The tour company had also made it clear that they would cooperate fully with any prosecution efforts, providing character testimony that would not be favorable to his defense. Marcus's family relationships had been severely strained by the incident. His parents, who lived in Scotland, had been horrified when they learned about his arrest through news reports rather than from him directly. His father, a retired police sergeant, was particularly disgusted by his son's actions. Their phone conversations had become increasingly tense and infrequent. "How could you do something so stupid?" his father had demanded during one painful conversation. "That guard was just doing his job, protecting the royal family and the public. And you attacked him for what? A laugh? Some internet attention?" His mother had tried to be more supportive, but Marcus could hear the disappointment and worry in her voice every time they spoke. She had started attending church regularly, praying for both her son and the injured guard, trying to find some way to make sense of what had happened. The preliminary court hearings were exercises in humiliation. Marcus had to sit in the dock while prosecutors outlined their case against him, describing his actions in clinical legal language that somehow made them sound even worse than they had felt at the time. The courtroom was always packed with journalists and curious members of the public, all eager to see the man who had become infamous for his tea attack. During one particularly difficult hearing, James Morrison's commanding officer gave testimony about the impact of the assault on the guard, unit's morale and operations. He described James as an exemplary soldier who had served his country with distinction, making Marcus's attack not just a personal assault, but an attack on the institution of the monarchy itself. Patricia had tried various defense strategies during the pre-trial phase, but each one crumbled under the weight of evidence. They couldn't claim it was accidental because the video footage clearly showed premeditation. They couldn't argue diminished capacity because Marcus had shown clear planning and awareness of his actions. They couldn't even argue for a reduced sentence based on remorse because Marcus's initial statements to police had focused on explaining his prank, rather than expressing concern for his victim. The most devastating blow came when James Morrison himself provided a victim impact statement to the court. Marcus listened as the prosecutor read James's words aloud, describing the physical and emotional trauma he had experienced. The burns had healed poorly, leaving visible scarring that would affect his appearance for the rest of his life. Worse, the psychological impact had been severe, with James developing anxiety about public appearances and crowd situations. "I joined the military to serve my country," James had written. "I accepted the risks that come with that service, including the possibility of injury or death in combat. What I never expected was to be deliberately attacked by a civilian while performing ceremonial duties in what should have been a safe environment." Marcus felt physically sick as he heard these words. The man he had injured wasn't just a faceless target in a prank gone wrong. He was a real person with a family, career aspirations, and a life that had been permanently altered by Marcus's thoughtless actions. The media coverage had also taken a toll on Marcus's mental health. Every day brought new articles analyzing his character, his background, and his motivations. Psychologists were interviewed about the mindset of people who commit pranks. Social media experts discussed the culture of viral content creation, and legal experts debated the appropriate punishment for his crimes. Marcus found himself becoming agoraphobic, afraid to leave his flat because he might be recognized by strangers. His social media accounts had been deactivated after receiving thousands of hostile messages, but the isolation from his normal support networks only made his depression worse. Sarah remained his most consistent supporter, but even she struggled with understanding how her friend had become capable of such cruelty. During their coffee meetings, which had once been filled with laughter and jokes, They now sat in awkward silence, both trying to figure out how to navigate their changed relationship. As the trial date approached, Patricia made one final attempt to negotiate some kind of plea agreement. She met with the Crown Prosecution Service to explore whether Marcus might receive a reduced sentence in exchange for an early guilty plea and a public apology. The prosecutors were unmoved. They intended to pursue the maximum possible sentence as a deterrent to others who might consider similar acts. The case had attracted too much public attention for them to appear lenient, and the severity of James Morrison's injuries made any kind of mercy politically impossible. Marcus realized that he was heading toward a trial he could not win, facing charges that would likely result in significant prison time. The prank that was supposed to last for a few seconds had set in motion legal proceedings that would dominate months of his life and determine his future for years to come. The trial began on a gray January morning at Southwark Crown Court, with Marcus walking through a gauntlet of photographers and reporters who had been waiting outside since dawn. The media attention had not diminished in the months since his arrest. If anything, it had intensified as the case became a symbol of broader social issues about internet culture, celebrity obsession, and respect for public servants. Judge Harrison, a stern woman in her 60s with decades of experience in criminal cases, presided over proceedings with the kind of no-nonsense authority that immediately made clear this would not be a forum for excuses or sympathy. Her opening remarks to the jury emphasized the seriousness of the charges and the need to focus on facts rather than emotions. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Lead prosecutor James Whitfield, QC, presented a timeline of events that painted Marcus not as someone who had made a tragic mistake, but as an individual whose escalating need for attention had led him to commit a premeditated assault on an innocent victim. Video evidence was shown from multiple angles, each replay making Marcus's actions look more deliberate and cruel. The prosecution had enhanced the footage to show clearly how Marcus had positioned himself, how he had gripped the cup, and how his stumble had been carefully choreographed to maximize the impact of the scalding liquid. Witness testimony was equally damaging. Tourist after tourist took the stand to describe what they had seen, many of them expressing shock and horror at Marcus's behavior. A child psychology expert testified about the impact the incident had had on young witnesses, some of whom had required counseling after seeing the guard's obvious pain and distress. The most powerful testimony came from James Morrison himself. Taking the stand with visible scarring still evident on his neck and the left side of his face, James spoke quietly but clearly about the impact the assault had had on his life. The courtroom was completely silent as he described the immediate, burning sensation, the weeks of medical treatment, and the ongoing psychological effects of the attack. "I have served in Afghanistan and Iraq," James said, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of reliving the experience. "I have faced enemy fire and improvised explosive devices, but I never expected to be deliberately harmed while serving ceremonial duties in my own country by someone who thought my pain would be entertaining." James described how the incident had affected his relationship with his fiancée, who had become protective and anxious about his safety even during routine duties. He spoke about the challenges of appearing in public with visible scarring, and how he had lost confidence in situations that had once felt completely safe and predictable. The medical testimony was particularly damaging to Marcus's case. Dr. Elizabeth Parker, the emergency room physician who had treated James, described the extent of his injuries in clinical detail. The temperature of the tea had been approximately 190 degrees Fahrenheit when it made contact with his skin, causing immediate second-degree burns that had penetrated deeply enough to cause permanent tissue damage. Burns of this severity are typically seen in industrial accidents or domestic violence cases, Dr. Parker explained to the jury. The victim was fortunate that the liquid did not make contact with his eyes, as that could have resulted in permanent blindness. Patricia Collins did her best to mount a defense for Marcus, but she was working with extremely limited material. Her strategy focused on portraying Marcus as someone who had made a terrible error in judgment, rather than someone with malicious intent. She brought in character witnesses who testified about Marcus's normally kind and gentle nature, his dedication, to his job as a tour guide, and his genuine remorse for what had happened. Marcus's former supervisor at the tour company provided reluctant testimony about his excellent performance record and the positive feedback he had consistently received from tourists. Several of his friends, including Sarah, spoke about his charitable work and his history of helping others, but all of this positive character testimony seemed insignificant when weighed against the evidence of what he had actually done. The defense also attempted to argue that Marcus's actions, while inexcusable, had been the result of an addiction to social media attention rather than genuine malice. A psychologist testified about the dopamine feedback loops created by viral content and likes, suggesting that Marcus had become trapped in a cycle of increasingly risky behavior designed to generate online reactions. But Judge Harrison was clearly unimpressed with this line of defense. During cross-examination, she pointedly asked the psychologist whether internet addiction was a recognized excuse for committing assault. The expert was forced to acknowledge that it was not, and that personal responsibility remained paramount, regardless of underlying psychological factors. When Marcus finally took the stand in his own defense, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. This was his chance to explain himself, to show remorse, and to convince the jury that he deserved mercy rather than the maximum sentence. Under Patricia's gentle questioning, Marcus spoke about his childhood, his career, and his gradual slide into increasingly attention-seeking behavior. He described the morning of the incident, acknowledging that he had planned what he thought would be a harmless prank, but had failed to consider the potential consequences of his actions. "I replay that moment every single day," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. "I see Guard Morrison's face and I hear his cry of pain, and I know that I caused that. There is no excuse for what I did. I was selfish and thoughtless, and an innocent man suffered because of my stupidity." But under cross-examination from Prosecutor Whitfield, Marcus's testimony became far less sympathetic. Whitfield methodically exposed the extent of Marcus's planning, the deliberate nature of his actions, and his initial lack of genuine remorse. He played recordings of Marcus's first police interview, in which Marcus had focused more on explaining that his prank had gone wrong than on expressing concern for his victim. "Mr. Henderson," Whitfield said, his voice cutting through the courtroom, "you spent weeks planning this assault. You researched the guard's schedules, you practiced your movements, you deliberately chose the hottest possible beverage to maximize the visual impact of your prank. This was not a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated attack on a serving member of Her Majesty's forces." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. Marcus stood in the dock, his legs trembling, as the foreman announced that they had found him guilty on all charges. The reaction from James Morrison's family and supporters was immediate and emotional, with several people openly weeping with relief. Judge Harrison's sentencing remarks were scathing. She described Marcus's actions as a callous and premeditated assault on a dedicated public servant, and noted that his behavior had brought shame not only upon himself, but upon the growing culture of viral content creation that values entertainment over human dignity. Judge Harrison sentenced Marcus to 2 years and 8 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving half his sentence. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions as the sentence was announced. James Morrison's supporters felt justice had been served, while Marcus's few remaining friends wept openly at seeing their friend led away in handcuffs. Prison was everything Marcus had feared and worse. HMP Pentonville, where he was initially housed, was overcrowded, violent, and filled with men who had little sympathy for someone they saw as a privileged tourist who had attacked a soldier. Marcus's crime had made him something of a celebrity even behind bars, but not the kind of fame he had ever wanted. The first few weeks were the hardest. Marcus was placed in protective custody after receiving threats from other inmates who viewed his assault on a military serviceman as particularly contemptible. He spent 23 hours a day in a small cell, with only 1 hour of supervised exercise in a concrete yard surrounded by high walls and razor wire. During those long, empty hours, Marcus was forced to confront the reality of who he had become. Without the constant stimulation of social media, pranks, and audience reactions, he was left alone with his thoughts for the first time in years. The silence was deafening and the boredom was crushing, but gradually he began to understand how his need for attention had consumed his life. Sarah visited him twice during his first month in prison, but the conversations were painful and awkward. Sitting across from each other in the sterile visiting room, separated by reinforced glass, they struggled to find anything meaningful to say. Sarah tried to be supportive, but Marcus could see the disappointment and confusion in her eyes. How had her funny, caring friend become someone capable of such cruelty? After 3 months, Marcus was transferred to HMP Wandsworth, where he was able to participate in more prison programs. He enrolled in anger management classes, not because he had anger issues, but because they were the closest thing available to therapy for someone trying to understand their own destructive behavior. The facilitator of these sessions was a former prisoner named David Chen, who had served 8 years for armed robbery before dedicating his life to helping other inmates understand and change their patterns of behavior. David was the first person in months who seemed to see Marcus as more than just the headlines that had defined him. "Everyone in here has a story about the moment they went too far," David told the group during one session. "The question isn't whether you did something terrible. The question is what you're going to do with the rest of your life now that you understand what you're capable of." Through these sessions, Marcus began to understand that his crime hadn't been an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of increasingly dangerous attention-seeking behavior. He started writing letters to James Morrison, not expecting forgiveness but needing to express his genuine remorse and take full responsibility for his actions. The letters were initially returned unopened, which Marcus accepted as completely reasonable. James had no obligation to engage with the person who had permanently scarred him, both physically and emotionally. But Marcus continued writing anyway, treating the exercise as a form of therapy rather than an attempt at communication. After 6 months in prison, Marcus received devastating news from home. His father had suffered a heart attack and was in intensive care in Edinburgh. Marcus was denied compassionate leave to visit, which meant he could only wait helplessly in his cell while receiving updates through brief, tense phone calls with his mother. His father survived but was permanently weakened, and Marcus knew that the stress of his son's imprisonment had contributed to his health crisis. The guilt was overwhelming, adding another layer to the consequences of his actions that extended far beyond his own punishment. As his release date approached, Marcus began participating in victim awareness programs designed to help offenders understand the long-term impact of their crimes. Guest speakers included victims of assault, robbery, and other violent crimes, all sharing their stories about how criminal acts had affected their lives. One speaker was a woman named Claire who had been attacked by a stranger in a case of mistaken identity. Her attacker had been sentenced to 4 years in prison, but Claire spoke about how the real sentence was the one she served every day. The anxiety, the hypervigilance, the way her sense of safety in the world had been permanently shattered. "Raw. Person who hurt me served their time and was released," Claire told the group. "But I'm still serving mine. Every unexpected noise, every stranger who gets too close, every moment of vulnerability reminds me of what happened. That's what you need to understand about the people you've harmed. Your sentence has an end date. Theirs might not." Marcus was released after serving 14 months of his sentence, emerging into a world that had moved on while he remained frozen in time. The story of his assault on the Royal Guard had been replaced by newer scandals and controversies, but the consequences of his actions continued to follow him everywhere he went. Finding employment proved nearly impossible. His criminal record made him unsuitable for most jobs, and those few employers willing to consider him inevitably discovered his identity through online searches. The viral videos of his crime remained easily accessible, ensuring that his worst moment would follow him indefinitely. Marcus eventually found work at a homeless shelter, one of the few organizations willing to employ someone with his background. The pay was minimal, barely enough to cover his basic expenses, but the work gave him a sense of purpose he had not felt since before his arrest. Working with homeless individuals taught Marcus about genuine hardship and resilience. Many of the people he served had overcome addiction, mental illness, domestic violence, and other challenges that made his own problems seem manageable in comparison. Their gratitude for simple acts of kindness reminded him of the person he had once been before his need for attention had consumed his better nature. 3 years after his release, Marcus received an unexpected letter. It was from James Morrison, who had finally decided to respond to one of the dozens of letters Marcus had sent over the years. The letter was brief and formal, but it acknowledged Marcus's expressions of remorse and indicated that James was working toward forgiveness as part of his own healing process. "I cannot say that I forgive you," James wrote, "but I can say that I no longer hate you. I hope that you have learned from this experience and that you never cause such harm to another person. That is the only good that can come from what happened between us." The letter was not the absolution Marcus had hoped for, but it was something more valuable, an acknowledgement that healing was possible. Even after such profound harm had been done, James had moved forward with his life, marrying his fiancée and continuing his military service despite the permanent scarring and ongoing medical issues caused by Marcus's attack. Marcus continued working at the homeless shelter, eventually becoming a supervisor and developing programs to help recently released prisoners reintegrate into society. His own experience with the criminal justice system, while traumatic, had given him insights that proved valuable in helping others navigate similar challenges. He never returned to social media, having learned that his addiction to digital attention had been at the root of his destructive behavior. Instead, he found satisfaction in smaller, more meaningful connections with the people he served and the colleagues who had come to respect his dedication and genuine remorse. On quiet evenings in his small flat, Marcus would sometimes reflect on the chain of events that had led from a moment of thoughtless cruelty to a completely transformed life. The young man who had thrown scalding tea at an innocent guard was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true weight of his actions and the responsibility that came with being capable of causing such harm. He would never be able to undo what he had done to James Morrison, but he could ensure that the rest of his life stood as evidence that people were capable of genuine change, even after their worst moments had been revealed to the world. The viral fame he had once craved had indeed made him infamous, but the quiet work of redemption he had undertaken in its aftermath had slowly begun to restore some small measure of meaning to his existence.